15th January, 1943, Stalingrad Pocket, Soviet Union. The horse died quietly in the snow, its breath forming one last cloud of vapor before its legs buckled beneath the weight of starvation. Obergefreiter Hans Diebold watched it fall, too exhausted to feel remorse. Around him, skeletal figures in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms shuffled forward, their frost-blackened fingers clutching rusted knives. There was no discussion, no hesitation. Within minutes, the carcass was surrounded. Men who had once marched triumphantly through France and the Low Countries now crawled through the frozen ruins of a Russian city, carving strips of raw, half-frozen horse meat with shaking hands. Some tried to light fires to cook it. Most didn't bother. They ate where they knelt, blood staining their beards, their eyes hollow and distant. One soldier muttered a prayer. Another laughed, a sound that held no humor, only madness. This wasn't war anymore. This was survival. And even survival, in the hell that Stalingrad had become, was a privilege few would be granted. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War, stories of courage, desperation, and the battles that pushed men beyond their limits. Where are you watching from today? And could you imagine enduring what these soldiers faced in those frozen ruins? To understand how the German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was reduced to eating its own horses in the ruins of a Soviet city, we must go back to the summer of 1942. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's catastrophic invasion of the Soviet Union, had begun in June 1941 with stunning initial success. German panzers had torn through Soviet defenses, encircling entire armies and advancing hundreds of kilometers in weeks. But the assault on Moscow in late 1941 had failed, halted by Soviet resistance and a winter so brutal it froze engine oil and shattered steel. By 1942, Hitler had refocused his strategy. Instead of a direct assault on Moscow, he launched Operation Blue, a massive offensive aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. Stalingrad was both a strategic prize and a symbolic one. Named after the Soviet dictator himself, its capture would deliver a devastating psychological blow to the Red Army and sever the Soviet Union's logistical lifeline. General Friedrich Paulus, a meticulous staff officer promoted to field command, led the German Sixth Army into the outskirts of Stalingrad in August 1942. His force numbered over 270,000 men, supported by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian auxiliaries. They brought with them over 500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and the confidence of an army that had conquered most of Europe. Opposing them was General Vasily Chuikov's Soviet 62nd Army, battered and outnumbered, but determined to hold the city at any cost. What neither side could have predicted was that Stalingrad would become the graveyard of the Wehrmacht, a frozen hell where men would be reduced to animals, where the line between life and death was measured not in victories, but in calories, in warmth, in the meat stripped from a dying horse. The battle began on 23 August 1942 with a Luftwaffe air raid so devastating it turned the sky black. Over 600 German aircraft pounded Stalingrad for hours, killing 40,000 civilians and setting the city ablaze. Flames spread across the wooden buildings, and burning oil from shattered refineries turned the Volga River into a corridor of fire. The city, already an industrial stronghold, was transformed overnight into a landscape of twisted metal, collapsed buildings, and charred corpses. German ground forces advanced into the ruins in mid-September, expecting a swift victory. They captured Mamayev Kurgan, a strategic hill overlooking the city, and pushed toward the Volga. But General Chuikov had implemented a brutal defensive strategy. His troops would hug the Germans, staying so close to enemy lines that Luftwaffe bombers and artillery couldn't be used without risking friendly fire. Every building became a fortress, every street became a trench. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. By October, the Germans had captured 90% of Stalingrad, compressing Chuikov's forces into a narrow strip along the Volga. Victory seemed inevitable, but the cost had been staggering. German casualties mounted daily, ammunition ran low, supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of hostile steppe were vulnerable to Soviet raids. And then, in November, the weather turned. Winter arrived early in 1942. Temperatures plummeted to -20, then -30 degrees Celsius. Snow blanketed the ruins. The Volga began to freeze. German soldiers, still in summer uniforms, suffered terribly. Frostbite claimed thousands. Fuel froze in vehicle engines. Horses, essential for transporting supplies, began to die in the cold. And still, the battle raged. Then, on 19th November 1942, the Soviets sprung their trap. Operation Uranus was a masterpiece of Soviet military planning. General Georgy Zhukov had quietly massed over 1 million troops north and south of Stalingrad, targeting the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies protecting the German flanks. At 7:30 a.m. on 19th November, Soviet artillery opened fire with devastating force. Over 3,500 guns shredded the Romanian positions. Soviet T-34 tanks and cavalry poured through the gaps, advancing rapidly across the frozen steppe. The Romanian Third Army, equipped with obsolete weapons and lacking anti-tank defenses, collapsed within hours. To the south, the Romanian Fourth Army met a similar fate. Within 4 days, Soviet pincers from the north and south had met at Kalach-on-the-Don, 50 kilometers west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army, along with elements of the Fourth Panzer Army, over 290,000 men, was now trapped inside a pocket roughly 50 kilometers wide and 30 kilometers deep. Paulus, stunned by the speed of the Soviet offensive, requested permission to break out westward while the encirclement was still weak. Hitler refused. He ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad and promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the army by air. It was a promise that would doom hundreds of thousands of men. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his aircraft could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day to the encircled Sixth Army, the minimum needed to sustain the troops. In reality, the Luftwaffe struggled to deliver even 100 tons per day. Blizzards grounded transport planes. Soviet anti-aircraft fire shot down dozens of Junkers Ju-52s and Heinkel He-111s. Fuel shortages limited flights. The airlift was a catastrophic failure. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated with terrifying speed. Fuel ran out first, immobilizing tanks and vehicles. Soldiers burned furniture, books, even their own uniforms to stay warm. Ammunition dwindled. Artillery batteries fell silent. The wounded died in makeshift field hospitals, their screams echoing through frozen basements. And then came the hunger. The German Sixth Army had entered Stalingrad with a robust supply system, but the encirclement severed all land routes. Within 2 weeks, rations were cut in half. By December, soldiers were receiving just 300 grams of bread per day, barely enough to survive in sub-zero temperatures while engaged in heavy combat. Men grew gaunt. Their eyes sank into their skulls. They moved like ghosts through the ruins, conserving energy, waiting for relief that never came. The horses were the first to go. The German army relied heavily on horses for transportation. In the Stalingrad pocket, there were tens of thousands of them, draft animals, cavalry mounts, and pack horses. As supplies dwindled and winter deepened, these horses began to starve alongside their handlers. Fodder ran out. The animals gnawed on wooden wagons, fence posts, anything they could find. They stood shivering in the snow, ribs protruding, eyes dull. By mid-December, the decision was made. The horses would be slaughtered for food. It began systematically. Veterinary officers and butchers organized the killings, trying to maintain some semblance of order. Horses were led to designated areas, shot in the head, and carved up. The meat was distributed according to rank and need. Officers received slightly larger portions, while enlisted men and the wounded got what remained. Every part of the animal was used. Hooves were boiled for gelatin, bones were crushed for marrow, hides were fashioned into crude boots and blankets. But as January 1943 arrived and the pocket shrank under relentless Soviet attacks, the systematic slaughter gave way to chaos. Horses were killed wherever they stood. Soldiers no longer waited for orders. They fell upon dying animals with knives, hatchets, even their bare hands. There were reports of men fighting over carcasses, of officers drawing pistols to maintain control over dwindling meat supplies. One German corporal, writing in his diary, described the scene with stark clarity. January 10th. We killed the last 3 horses today. The men fell on them like wolves. I watched a lieutenant eat raw liver, his face smeared with blood. He didn't even look human anymore. None of us do. Another soldier, in a letter smuggled out on one of the last transport flights, wrote to his wife, "We are no longer soldiers. We are starving animals. I ate horse meat yesterday, raw, because there was no wood to burn. I cannot describe the taste. I cannot describe what we have become. If I survive this, I will never be the man you married." The horse meat sustained the German Sixth Army for a few more weeks, but it was a temporary reprieve. By late January, even the horses were gone. Soldiers resorted to eating anything they could find: leather belts boiled into a gelatinous paste, boot soles chewed for sustenance, wallpaper scraped off walls for the traces of flour in the paste. There were whispered rumors, never confirmed, always denied, of cannibalism among isolated groups of soldiers in the most desperate sectors of the pocket. Typhus and dysentery spread through the ranks. Men too weak to fight lay in frozen cellars, waiting to die. The cold claimed as many lives as Soviet bullets. Frostbite amputations were performed without anesthesia, the screams of the victims blending with the sounds of artillery. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, newspapers, and blankets stripped from corpses. Some simply lay down in the snow and never got up. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had launched Operation Winter Storm in mid-December, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement and relieve the Sixth Army. Spearheaded by elite panzer divisions, Manstein's forces advanced to within 48 kilometers of the pocket's perimeter. For a brief moment, salvation seemed possible. Radio messages crackled through the frozen air. "Hold on, relief is coming." But Paulus, constrained by Hitler's orders, refused to authorize a breakout to meet Manstein's advancing forces. The gap was too wide, his men were too weak, his tanks had no fuel, and so Manstein's offensive stalled, then collapsed as Soviet reinforcements arrived. By Christmas 1942, the relief effort had failed utterly. The Sixth Army was alone. January 1943 was the endgame. The Soviets launched Operation Ring,
a methodical offensive designed to crush the German pocket from all sides. Soviet artillery pounded German positions day and night. Katyusha rocket launchers screamed overhead, obliterating what remained of German defensive lines. Soviet infantry, now equipped with winter gear and bolstered by fresh reinforcements, advanced steadily through the ruins. The German resistance was fierce but futile. Soldiers fought from cellars, from burnt-out tanks, from piles of rubble. They fired until their ammunition ran out, then fought with bayonets, clubs, and bare hands. But they were starving, freezing, and dying. Entire battalions ceased to exist. Regiments that had once numbered thousands were reduced to dozens. Officers stopped writing reports. There was nothing left to report. On 8th January, the Soviets offered surrender terms. Paulus was promised humane treatment for his men, medical care for the wounded, and repatriation after the war. He forwarded the offer to Hitler, requesting permission to surrender. Hitler's response was unequivocal. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will hold its positions to the last man and the last round. Paulus obeyed. The bombardment resumed.
By late January, the German pocket had been split in two. The southern group, trapped near the city center, was cut off from the northern group around the factories. Communication between the two pockets broke down. Each fought in isolation, unaware of the other's fate. On 30th January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal in a cynical gesture meant to pressure him into fighting to the death. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear. Paulus was expected to commit suicide rather than capitulate. But Paulus had seen enough. He had watched his army disintegrate. He had witnessed men reduced to eating horses, to gnawing on leather, to dying in agony from starvation and disease. On 31st January, he surrendered the southern pocket. 2 days later, on 2nd February 1943, the northern pocket capitulated. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Of the 290,000 German and Axis soldiers encircled at Stalingrad, fewer than 6,000 ever returned home. The rest died in the pocket or in Soviet captivity. Soviet POW camps were brutal. Prisoners were marched through the snow in sub-zero temperatures, housed in unheated barracks, and given minimal food. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed thousands. Starvation continued even after surrender. Many survivors later said that the camps were worse than the battle itself. The horses, too, had paid a terrible price. Tens of thousands of them perished in the Stalingrad pocket, killed for food, frozen to death, or caught in artillery barrages. Their bones littered the ruins for years after the war, silent witnesses to the desperation that had consumed both men and beasts. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense. German veterans of Stalingrad spoke of nightmares that lasted for decades, dreams of frozen comrades, of eating raw horse meat, of the sound of Soviet artillery. One veteran, interviewed in the 1980s, said simply, "I died at Stalingrad. The man who came home was someone else." Stalingrad marked the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. The German Wehrmacht, which had seemed invincible in 1941, had been decisively defeated. The myth of German military superiority was shattered. Stalin's propaganda machine turned the victory into a symbol of Soviet resilience and strength. The Red Army, bloodied but unbroken, began its long march westward, a march that would end in Berlin in May 1945. For Hitler, Stalingrad was a personal humiliation.
He had gambled on a symbolic victory and lost an entire field army. His refusal to allow a breakout, his faith in Göring's airlift promises, and his insistence on holding the city at all costs condemned hundreds of thousands of men to death. The German home front, previously insulated from bad news, could no longer ignore the magnitude of the disaster. Goebbels' propaganda struggled to explain away the loss. Morale cracked. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was a moral one. The images of starving German soldiers, the reports of men eating horses and dying in droves, exposed the brutal reality of Hitler's war. The myth of the heroic Wehrmacht, so carefully cultivated through the early victories, was replaced by a darker truth. The German army was not invincible. It could be beaten. It could be starved. It could be broken.
The story of the horses at Stalingrad is often overlooked in the grand narratives of the battle. Historians focus on strategy, on troop movements, on the encirclement and the surrender. But for the men who fought there, the horses were a lifeline, and then a last meal. They represented the descent from civilized warfare into primal survival. Soldiers who had once ridden these animals into battle now carved them up with knives, their hands numb from cold and hunger. In the final weeks of the pocket, as the last horses were slaughtered and consumed, some soldiers refused to participate. They couldn't bring themselves to eat the animals they had relied on for so long. These men starved faster than their comrades. Others ate without hesitation, driven by a survival instinct that overrode sentiment. There was no judgment among the men, only the shared understanding that they were all damned. One German officer, reflecting on the experience years later, said, "We ate the horses because the alternative was death, and yet in eating them, we lost something essential. We crossed a line. We became something less than human. Stalingrad didn't just kill us, it degraded us." The ruins of Stalingrad, rebuilt into the modern city of Volgograd, bear few visible scars from the battle, but the memory endures. Monuments stand on Mamayev Kurgan, the hill where so much blood was spilled. Museums display artifacts, rusted helmets, frozen rations, letters never sent. And in the archives, the testimonies of survivors remain, stark, haunting accounts of men pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The Battle of Stalingrad claimed over 2 million casualties, soldiers and civilians combined. It destroyed a city and an army. It changed the course of the war and the trajectory of history. But perhaps its most enduring legacy is what it revealed about war itself, that it strips away civilization, reduces men to their most basic instincts, and leaves scars that never truly heal. The German soldiers who ate their horses at Stalingrad were not monsters. They were men, ordinary men caught in an extraordinary nightmare. They had been promised victory and glory. Instead, they found frozen ruins, starvation, and death. They fought not for ideology or conquest, but for survival. And in the end, even survival was denied to most of them. So, when you imagine Stalingrad, don't just think of the grand strategies and the turning points. Think of Obergefreiter Hans Diebold, kneeling in the snow beside a dead horse, his hands numb, his stomach aching with hunger. Think of the soldiers who carved strips of raw meat from frozen carcasses, who ate to live another day in a hell that offered no escape. Think of the horses themselves, faithful animals reduced to sustenance, their sacrifice unmarked and unmourned. War is not glorious. It is not heroic. It is brutal, degrading, and profoundly human. Stalingrad taught that lesson with merciless clarity. And the question remains, if you had been there, cold and starving in those frozen ruins, what would you have done? Would you have had the strength to survive?
Or would the weight of that nightmare have crushed you? History does not answer these questions. It only preserves them, reminders of the cost of ambition, the price of war, and the depths to which humanity can sink when pushed to the edge. But while Stalingrad consumed the Eastern Front, another struggle was unfolding across the Atlantic, a battle fought not on land, but beneath the waves. Join us next time as we uncover the story of the U-boat war, the deadly contest for control of the seas that nearly brought Britain to its knees. Subscribe now and never miss a story from the war that tested the limits of human endurance.